This finalized script has been updated for 2 reasons. The grammar has been corrected to ensure flawless American English, and all numbers have been converted into words for optimal narration flow. My faded duffel bag hit the imported marble of Julian's Miami penthouse with a wet thud. Outside, a tropical storm hammered the glass. But my brother's voice was colder than the rain. He tossed a rusted key at my boots. He told me my depressing secretary vibe was ruining the aesthetic for Harper's luxury gala. He told me to take the key to the abandoned shipyard he just acquired and sleep with the rest of the trash. Have you ever been completely discarded by the very people you sacrificed everything to help? Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community, standing on the wet pavement as the heavy glass doors of the lobby locked behind me. I let the wind whip rain across my face. I forced my breathing to slow down. I refused to break. In my world of logistics and operations, emotion is just bad data. And right now, I needed complete clarity. Wiping the water from my eyes, I picked up my duffel bag and ordered a ride to the industrial edge of Miami. The driver dropped me off in front of a rotting, hurricane-battered warehouse. The metal siding was peeling, and the air smelled of salt, rust, and decay. Before I even put the rusted key into the padlock, my phone vibrated in my soaked pocket. It was a screenshot forwarded by a former colleague. Julian was not just kicking me out. He was actively liquidating my reputation. He was messaging their elite social circles, spinning a fabricated narrative to protect his golden boy image. He told the venture capitalists and the country club members that I was mentally unstable. He claimed I was a hoarder who had completely lost her grip on reality, explaining away my sudden disappearance to a shipyard as a tragic, undeniable personal choice. He painted himself as the exhausted, benevolent brother dealing with a toxic family liability. A minute later, a second message arrived. This one was directly from Julian. It was a forwarded utility notice from the city, and the amount due was staggering. $8,500. His text beneath the bill was simple. It said, "Pay this by Friday, or I am having the city rip the meter out of your new dump." I stood in the sweltering, pitch-black cavern of the warehouse, listening to the storm hammer the tin roof. I looked at the glowing number on my screen again. $8,500 in a single month for an abandoned, empty building. That is not a forgotten light bulb or a leaky pipe. That is a massive, continuous draw of industrial power. Julian thought he was burying me under a mountain of unpayable debt. He was entirely too arrogant to look past his own cruelty. He forgot that I audit complex systems for a living. And he had just handed me the ledger. I did not panic over the notice. I went to work, pulling a flashlight from my bag. I traced the thickest electrical conduit lines starting from the main breaker panel. They did not run to the rusted overhead fixtures. They snaked across the ceiling trusses and disappeared directly behind a pristine, newly constructed drywall partition at the far end of the warehouse. Grabbing a heavy iron crowbar from a discarded tool pile, I did not hesitate. I jammed the steel beneath the seam and cracked the drywall wide open. A sudden blast of freezing, asterla, conditioned air hit my sweating face, stepping through the jagged hole. The ambient noise of the tropical storm vanished. It was replaced by the low, steady hum of heavy-duty industrial dehumidifiers. I was no longer standing in a rotting shipyard. I was standing inside a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled vault. Lined up in perfect, military precision were 12 shimmering, inflated plastic preservation capsules. Inside each one rested a pristine, unreleased prototype hypercar. They were lost pieces of automotive history, hidden away from the world. Standing there in the freezing dark, 5 years of my life, processed through my mind in a single second. I had always been the silent engine of Julian's empire. When his venture capital firm was quietly bleeding cash, I was the one who restructured his liabilities at 2 a.m. When he smiled for magazine covers, I was the one quietly paying the delinquent property taxes to keep his assets from foreclosure. My invisible labor was the concrete foundation holding up his penthouse lifestyle. He treated me like a broken appliance, a depressing secretary to be discarded the moment my usefulness ran out. But that invisible labor had trained me. It gave me the exact analytical precision required to completely dismantle him. He thought he exiled me to the trash. Instead, he locked me inside the bank vault. I pulled out my phone. I did not call Julian. I called Silas. Silas was a ruthless, high-end asset liquidator I had contracted during complex international freight recoveries. He arrived 40 minutes later, stepping through the rusted warehouse doors with a deeply skeptical frown. Then I led him through the broken drywall. Silas stopped breathing. He walked slowly down the line of capsules, his hands visibly shaking as he read the vehicle identification numbers through the plastic. He turned to me, his eyes wide in the sterile light, and gave me the conservative, fast liquidation estimate. $35 million. Silas gave me the number, but I did not celebrate or gasp. I simply opened my laptop on top of a rusted barrel and began drafting a legally binding transfer of property. I knew exactly how to play my brother. Narcissists like Julian have a fatal, vertical blind spot. They spend their entire lives looking up at the penthouses, the status, and the wealth, completely terrified of looking down. To him, manual labor was an infection. Dirt was a disease. He treated this shipyard like a radioactive zone, useful only as a line item on a balance sheet. That arrogance was about to become his financial grave. I worded the contract with absolute precision. I defined the unexamined contents of the warehouse, not as assets, but as hazardous industrial waste. I attached a clause highlighting a potential $100,000 city disposal penalty if the site was not cleared immediately. Julian was currently desperate to finalize a $1.2 million land sale for this exact property to cover his mounting private debts. The last thing he wanted was a 6-figure environmental fine holding up his closing date. I met him at the edge of the shipyard the next morning. He pulled up in his pristine imported sedan, refusing to even step out of the vehicle and risk dirtying his tailored suit in the puddles of oil and rainwater. He rolled down the window, pressing a silk handkerchief over his nose to block out the smell of the bay. Handing him the clipboard, I told him I would take full legal liability for the disposal of the waste, but only if he signed over the complete rights to everything left inside the building. He laughed. It was a short, sharp, mocking sound. He called me a glorified garbage collector. He told me I was finally doing exactly what I was meant to do, cleaning up his messes so he could focus on the big picture. He was so desperate to wash his hands of the liability, so completely blinded by his elitist disgust, that he did not read a single clause. He grabbed his gold pen and signed the transfer, handing the clipboard back. He rolled up his window and sped off toward his air-conditioned life. He did not realize he had just legally signed away $35 million in lost automotive history. He thought he had outsmarted the depressing secretary, but in my line of work, the fine print is always where the execution happens. And I had just secured sole ownership of the entire fleet. The lighting at Harper's luxury gala was a soft, calculated gold. I walked through the massive double doors of the grand ballroom, the heavy oak shutting behind me with a soft, final click. I did not wear a sequined gown. I wore the exact same tailored black blazer I used to negotiate Julian's corporate debt. The room was a sea of imported silk, crystal champagne flutes, and strategic, murmured conversations. As I stepped onto the carpet, The whispers nearest to me began to die out. One by one, at the absolute center of the room, surrounded by the men he called his investors, stood my brother. He was holding a glass of vintage bourbon, the ice clinking softly against the rim as he gestured with his free hand. He was in the middle of a practiced performance. I stopped at the edge of his circle, perfectly still, watching him construct his own financial grave. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. I watched the realization hit his eyes, followed immediately by a mask of theatrical, practiced pity. He turned to the men in their $4,000 suits, lowering his voice. He kept it just loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear every single syllable. "Gentlemen, please forgive the unfortunate interruption," he murmured, his tone dripping with fabricated sorrow. "This is my sister, Maya. As I was just telling you, she has been struggling terribly with her mental stability. I had to transition her out of the penthouse for her own well-being. It is a tragic situation, but we are doing everything we can to manage her hoarding episodes and erratic behavior." He smiled at me with a deeply patronizing, gendered smirk. He looked at me, not as an operational threat, but as a hysterical woman who had wandered out of her designated place. He assumed my presence was a desperate emotional outburst. He assumed I was there to cry, to beg for my room back, to make a messy public scene that would perfectly validate every lie he had just fed to his backers. It was the ultimate intellectual trap. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that I was never a fragile girl looking for a handout. I was an auditor, and I was holding the receipts. I let the heavy silence stretch. I let the elite crowd stare at me with uncomfortable, piercing pity. I let Julian soak in the absolute power of his own lie, allowing his ego to inflate to its maximum capacity. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my sanity. Emotion is a liability when you are closing a deal. I simply reached into my jacket, opened the thin leather folder in my hands, and pulled out 2 crisp, white sheets of paper. I did not hand the documents to Julian. I handed them directly to the man standing on his right, the very person he had just been desperately trying to impress. "This is a legally binding transfer of property," I said. My voice was perfectly level, carrying clearly through the dead silence of the ballroom. "Signed by Julian at 8 o'clock this morning. It grants me sole and irrevocable ownership of all contents inside the shipyard warehouse, which he formally classified as hazardous industrial waste to avoid city disposal fees." Julian lowered his glass, his brow furrowing in confusion. He opened his mouth to spin another lie, but I was already handing over the second sheet of paper. "And this," I continued, "is the official asset appraisal from Sotheby's, completed at 3 o'clock this afternoon. The 12 pristine, lost prototype hypercars hidden in a climate-controlled vault directly behind his so-called waste are unconditionally valued at $35 million. The investor looked down at the crisp white paper. He read the staggering number aloud. $35 million. The silence in the room became absolute. I watched Julian's biological response in slow motion. The color drained from his face, leaving a pale, breathless terror. The patronizing smirk dissolved completely. He had spent his entire life assuming his little sister, the depressing secretary, could never outmaneuver him. He assumed a woman in a warehouse was too emotional, too fragile, too busy crying in the rain to actually audit the ledger. He assumed he was the only visionary in the family. That gendered arrogance had just cost him a $35 million empire. He dropped his glass. It shattered against the marble floor, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. But the true execution happened instantly. The man holding the appraisal did not look at Julian with awe or pity. His eyes darkened, and the high society veneer vanished in a fraction of a second. These men were not elite venture capitalists. They were aggressive, hard money lenders. The lead lender stepped forward, closing the distance between them until they were chest to chest. "You told us that property was completely empty," the man said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly whisper. "You told us you were closing the land sale tomorrow for $1.2 million to cover the $400,000 you owe us," Julian stammered, taking a panicked step back. But there was nowhere to go. Two other men from the circle shifted seamlessly, physically blocking his path to the grand doors. The surrounding crowd of elites intuitively shrank back, sensing the immediate threat of violence beneath the tailored suits. Julian had signed away the only asset capable of saving him. Just to avoid getting his expensive shoes dirty, he was completely trapped, humiliated, and financially ruined in the center of the very room he had rented to show off his fake wealth. I stood perfectly still as the invisible walls of Julian's own arrogance closed in around him. He looked past the broad shoulders of the men cornering him, his eyes locking onto mine. For the first time in his entire life, the golden boy was looking at me not as a burden, but as a lifeline. His silent, panicked stare begged me to fix it. He wanted me to step in, to restructure his debt, to play the loyal, invisible engine one last time. I did not feel pity. Compassion is a currency he had overdrafted for years, and my account with him was permanently closed. I looked at him, my expression completely flat, and delivered my final audit. "Your liabilities are no longer my problem." I turned my back on the empire he never really built. I walked out of the grand ballroom, the heavy oak doors sealing his fate behind me. When I stepped out onto the pavement, the storm had finally broken. The Miami night air was warm, clear, and completely silent. I pulled out my phone and blocked his number, his email, his entire existence. It was the most profitable transaction of my life. Without my invisible labor, Julian's fabricated life collapsed in a matter of weeks. The hard money lenders stripped him of everything, and his carefully curated high society reputation was reduced to a pathetic, cautionary whisper at the country club. He was left chasing a status he could no longer afford to rent. As for me, I liquidated the fleet and bought my own logistics firm. I am sitting in my new waterfront penthouse office right now. The morning sun is reflecting off the bay, and the only sound is the quiet hum of my computer. I am reviewing the monthly balance sheets. There are no hidden debts. There are no forced bailouts. And when I look at the top of the ledger, there is only one name: mine. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family to finally build your own empire? Let me know your story in the comments below. And do not forget to subscribe for more stories of sweet, silent karma.